Welcome, Slayer the Alchemist, and welcome to another edition of Sabbath Sunday. This is where we get together with you on Sunday to discuss all things Black Sabbath. We have a special guest with us today. John McEntee joins us. He wants to talk about cross purposes. Darin and I, we have a Black Sabbath podcast, Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast. Our latest episode is on the album Cross Purposes. Soon as that episode dropped, I got a message from John. He said, I'm calling you guys out. I've had enough. Meet me after school. I'm going to put you guys in your place here. So Darin and I, we've had a couple weeks to debate, prep this. We've been doing some mock debates, trying to figure out how John's going to come at us, maybe with the uppercut at first. Maybe he's going to come in fast and strong. We don't know, but he's here. We're happy that he's here. John, thanks for coming, joining us here at the Lair. So before you get into your cross purposes, though, tell us where are you at with the Tony Martin era in general? Tell us where you're at with Tony Martin in general, and then give
Well,
us your thoughts on cross
okay.
purposes.
If you don't mind, I kind of want to do a little bit of a backstory to kind of explain the situation because I think that'll help make sense out of my opinions on stuff a little bit, at least where I'm coming from. I'll try to make it quick because I know I could be long-winded. Um, but basically, when the Tony Martin albums came out, like Eternal Idol and stuff, it was around the time I was working at a record store, and I always seen that album and just was like, I just don't know. Something seems wrong about it. And that was right around the time where I was really, really getting into like the underground tape trading scene and stuff like that. And it was just like, it's almost seemed like, well, do I want to like waste my money on this bloated horse of a band, or do I want to check out some of the new fiery bands that are coming up from the underground? I mean, so I really did not have much interest in Sabbath at that time, except for maybe the Ozzy years even. I mean, at that time, I I before that I liked Dio stuff, but once I started getting into heavier stuff, I kind of just threw all that stuff aside and just really focused on extreme thrash, death metal, and early grindcore kind of stuff. That was like my obsession, um, new music wise, probably for the next I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10 years or something like that, where I didn't really pay much attention. I would just every once in a while I'd pop on, some classic Sabbath album, Sabotage or something. That was good enough for me. I didn't need to have any more Sabbath. And then I it wasn't until yeah, I'm just thinking back and I remember times of seeing these albums come out like Cross Purposes, Forbidden, stuff like that. And I'm just like, I don't know. Like I remember seeing that photo on the Forbidden album with like Tony Martin with the long nose and stuff. And I was just like, this just is like really, I don't know. I just like it's not even worth my time. I was kind of a elitist asshole when it came to like, music at that time. I was like, I really wanted the hard bite of music, the I guess I wanted the future of music at that time. But basically by like 1999, I think it was, I was working with one of our drummers for the Infernal Storm album. It happened to be, well, it was the drummer for Malevolent Creation. So it was Dave Koros. And I was staying over at Phil's house while I was jamming with him on stuff, and he had Cross Purposes Live. And I was like, he's telling me how much a Black Sabbath fan he is and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, I like Sabbath, but I only really like the old stuff or whatever. And he was playing it on. He's like, oh, dude, this stuff's sick or whatever. It's really fucking cool. And I checked it out, and I was like, it's okay. It's not bad. I mean, I wasn't really into the Tony Martin songs on there, I would say, but I like the fact that they did some cool Sabbathy, Ozzy songs, and even some of the Dio songs. I was like, oh, this guy sounds actually pretty good. And at the same time, I kind of started revisiting Dio around that same time too. That was the time I think of Magica came out, and something hit me with Magica, like it was a heavy album. It might not be his best album, but it was a heavy album. So I was like, okay, maybe it's worth like doing my homework and like checking this stuff out. And I actually had even Dio's Strange Highways, but I hardly ever listened to it. I just had it like in my collection because someone I got it like as a promo from somebody. And I started revisiting all this Black Sabbath stuff, and that kind of reignited my interest in Black Sabbath again. But I ended up hearing um, Cross Purposes pretty early on in that revisiting of Black Sabbath, and I was just like, it just isn't right. Something just not. It just didn't click me the right way. I just didn't. It didn't resonate with me at all, and it actually I put Tony, like I didn't even listen to any of the other Tony Martin stuff. Like if this is like where we're going with this, it's like I'm just not interested. And I kind of went into the whole Dio era and started really revisiting that and appreciating it more even than when I was a younger kid. When the original band was out enjoying it and stuff. But what am I getting at here? The yeah, I like I said, I didn't like that album. What I did is I heard um we were on tour in South America. It was in Brazil. They have that Galleria Rock there, and they have all these bootlegs that time where you couldn't find them hardly, stuff tough to find them in the States and they were expensive. They were like bootlegs of bootlegs. So we just went there and they were selling it for really cheap. Like you can get like, we would spend $100 and come back with like so much merch you could barely fit in our suitcase at that time. So I just picked up all these Sabbath bootleg albums, and one of them was the Eternal Idol, but with Ray Gillan singing. And it had that plus some live stuff on there. I think it's the same live stuff that was on the reissue. And I heard that and I was like, God damn, this is good. Like his vocals were so good. Ray Gillan was just killing it on vocals. It just like it just totally like I listened to it like that was the for like probably 6 months to a year. That was like the main Sabbath thing I would listen to is Ray Gillan with Sabbath. And I remember turning it on to like all my friends and stuff, being like, holy crap, this is like some hidden gem. And then one day I was like, you know what? Let's hear what the original, not the original, but the actual album sounds like with Tony Martin. And I listened to it, I was like, oh, it's pretty good. It's not bad. And then it went from that to like, this guy's really good singer. Like he really, his songs are really good. And it almost like now I don't even listen to the Ray Gillan version that much, even though I like it still. I think the Tony Martin version of it is great. And I like the Tony, I mean, I love that album. I love um what was it? Headless Cross and the Tear album. Those were all I was just like, this guy is a madman on vocals. I just loved his just the way he was singing. It sounded like it just had there was he brought a life to the stuff, and he was also really good at from the bootlegs I had because I got some bootlegs of him playing like just assorted shows um around the Eternal Idol time, and I was just so impressed with how his vocals were and stuff, and such a big fan. And I delayed on like even giving him a chance because I was just like I thought Cross Purposes sucked so bad that I was just like I didn't think that this guy had that in him to do those albums as good as he did. So basically my the way I look at it is like I love his stuff at this point up until um the Tear album. I think it's amazing. Some of my favorite Sabbath stuff is that. I mean, I get into like we all do, sometimes I'll listen to want to hear the old stuff, sometimes I want to hear some of the Dio stuff, and other times I want to hear this stuff. I mean, of course, Born Again I want to listen to all every day if I can. But and then I tried listening to Cross Purposes, and I still couldn't get into it because it seemed like his voice got unexciting. He wasn't going for it anymore. It's funny because you guys were mentioning that you thought that this was him coming into his own. And to me, it sounded like and I hate to say this, I love Sabbath, and I think a lot of the music is pretty good on those albums. Actually, but vocal wise, it really kind of kills it for me. But I just think in general, those albums have too much of a influence by grunge, and I was not a grunge fan. I went as far as like Nirvana's was it the Bleach album, I think it was, and Nevermind, and after that, I just wasn't interested in that stuff at all. Like the I can't even think of the bands right now, but any of the popular bands like Soundgarden or Alice in Chains, I was just like, no, no, that's fucking lame. I wasn't interested in that, because I was grunge to me just always seemed like it seemed just fucking lame as fuck. It was just like I'm not trying to be mean about it either. I'm just because I know you guys might be fans of it or whatever, but I always looked at it, it was lame. It was just like almost like easygoing, trying to be 70s rock, but trying to do it in this punk rock way. And I just felt like it was very righteous and just not like I liked the over the top and the excess and the just being almost like being a dick or something like that. Be a good way about it. And with that, it had a much more gentler, sensitive side to it on grunge. And I just wasn't my thing musically. So I think that being said, that's really the main reason why, for cross purposes, I don't like the album because I think they were too concerned about being contemporary at the time, and it didn't seem to bother me as much on. I mean, it didn't bother me at all on the previous albums that Tony Martin did because I I could kind of relate to that, what he was doing on there more for some reason. Like I thought it was just to me, I know you guys have a different opinion. You think this album might be heavier, but I find the first three albums he did heavier albums and just more in the mood. Like, it was almost like an extension of the Dio years or something when Tony Martin came to the band. And for me, that was a pleasant era to discover. But when it got to cross purposes and then Forbidden, I mean, I listened to Forbidden again after your episode of that too, because I wanted to listen to that. And I mean, there's stuff on there that's just atrocious, but there's also some stuff on there that is actually pretty good. And I do think if they were able to pull songs from both albums and just spend a little more time thinking about the songs more than just because to me it seemed like both of those albums came out as an excuse to put out an album. And I hate to say that because I love Sabbath, but they did. I mean, I thought what was it? Dehumanizer was an amazing album. And I love that album from front to back. There's no songs in that I don't like. And just within a year and a half, maybe less than that, probably a year of that, they put out Cross Purposes. And it's like it doesn't resonate even close to what I think of Dehumanizer as far as song structure goes and stuff. I mean, it has some good songs on it. And we can get into it if you want to talk about some of the songs. But as far as like just an overall piece of an overall album, it seems like Dehumanizer was really well-rounded, well thought out album. And Cross Purposes was an album that was put out like it had its moments, has its moments where it's genius on it, but it's not coherently. The whole thing is not good. For me, it sounds like it's rushed, especially some of Tony Martin's vocal patterns. It some of them on this and Forbidden, it sounds just like he was told, okay, do some vocals over this part, but they're not really working out the vocal lines in a good way. It was like almost like they had the song finished and he had a piece of paper and just said, okay, fit these words in here. But when I feel like on the earlier stuff, the melodies of his vocals worked better over the riffing. It brought more to the song, but like I said, you could tell that, at least for me, I could tell there's a major grunge influence on this album. I didn't notice really the grunge influence on Dehumanizer, but this one and Forbidden, it almost sounds like they were letting the time dictate their writing a little bit more than they should have. And it kills me to say that because I respect Tony Iommi as a songwriter, and I'm one of those Looney Tunes that thinks almost anything Tony does is like Black Sabbath or I mean, a solo stuff I don't think is Black Sabbath, but when any Sabbath album, even the ones that probably should have been solo albums, still to me are Sabbath albums for the most part. I'm still a little long-winded, but I tried.
No, it makes
What's going
sense because you're coming into it. It isn't interesting. I've never heard anybody say they came into the Tony Martin era through cross purposes. So I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I discovered the Tony Martin era with Headless Cross or Tear, but I've never heard anybody say they came into it through cross purposes. So I can understand how that might be a strange way to come into Tony Martin. And as you mentioned, and I agree with you, his singing, he's very over, I don't want, yeah, over the top, like on Headless Cross and Tear, his vocal range, he's pushing his vocal range. Whereas I think on Cross Purposes, he sort of reins it in a little bit. And I think that's where I mean, Darin will comment here in a second. I know for me, that's where I kind of feel like Tony Martin settles into more of who he is because he's doing away a little bit with the very histrionic metal type of singing. It's cross as much as I love that stuff. I mean, I love it. I think he sounds amazing on that stuff. But for me personally, I think Tony Martin's comfort zone is more like the Cross of Thorns, uh, that type of sound and the sound that he gets on Cross Purposes and where he is lyrically on Cross Purposes, I think feels more natural to him. Whereas Tyr, the Norse mythology, the devils and dragons of Headless Cross and everything. But I do hear where you're coming from too with the 90s influence because yeah, you're right. And I mean, I do think that they probably were influenced some by what was happening there in the 90s. So I can see how that could be off-putting to somebody. And again, if you haven't sort of eased into I love The Eternal Idol. That's probably my favorite Tony Martin album. But I
Mhm.
can see kind of if you sort of missed out on that, and then all of a sudden you come in through cross purposes, that it could be a little bit like, whoa, what is going on here? Darin?
For me, the Tony Martin era was always kind of a hard sell. I didn't really embrace it when it was active. Um, for each album we've talked about, and I've talked about how I became aware of the album, and usually it was that I was in a record store and there it was, and I hadn't heard anything about it, and I looked at the album cover and it sort of looked kind of ambiguous, like is this a Black Sabbath studio album or is this best of? The album cover looks kind of generic. There was always something about it that it kind of seemed detached and not really that well integrated with the 2 or 3 eras. I guess you could say 3 eras if you want to consider Gillan as an era of the band. Uh, but the Tony Martin era never seemed to be comparable to what came before. It seemed like this point in the band's history where they were just doing it so that they could do it, so that Tony Iommi could make money, so that he could work, and whoever was available at the time, whoever he felt like he could have a working partnership with, was going to be in the band. A couple albums, it was Cozy Powell, and then it became mostly Tony Iommi and Tony Martin, apparently. But from the beginning, I was never really a big Tony Martin era fan. So I kind of like tiptoed into this, and I was very tentative with it. And some things I was open to, and other things I was really quick to shut down. So when we're talking about cross purposes, and we're talking about the historical context and the background of music at the time, we're talking about grunge. Yeah, I mean grunge was huge, but I wasn't really a grunge person. I mean, when I was introduced to some of those bands like Soundgarden and Mudhoney and later on Nirvana, it was mostly as it was an extension. I used to go to this record store in Philadelphia called Philadelphia Record Exchange, and the dudes that owned it they were like punk rockers, you know. So they had picture of Saint Vitus, and they had like a promo picture of Saint Vitus, and above that they had a promo picture that SST, which is also Saint Vitus's record label. SST was the
Yeah,
first label. Well, actually, the first label was Sub
Black
Pop,
Flag.
and then Soundgarden released an album on SST. I forget what it was called. But anyway, so there was a promo picture of Soundgarden above the picture of Saint Vitus, and so that was kind of introduced to me. I mean, I knew Saint Vitus, and I knew Saint Vitus was Sabbathy, and I knew they were doomy. And so I saw the picture of Soundgarden. I asked the guy, well, who's Soundgarden? What kind of music are they? He's like, oh, it's kind of Sabbathy. It's like a combination of Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. I said, oh, that sounds pretty cool. Check that out. So I got the album. I wish I could remember what the name of the album was
Louder
on
Than Love, maybe?
SST.
Is it
No, it
Louder
wasn't
Than
Loud
Love?
in Love. It was the one before that.
Uh,
But anyway, I bought that and I listened to it and I thought it was real heavy and slow and kind of bitey, but the singer was better. So I dug it because it kind of reminded me of like 70s Sabbath. And there's a little bit of, I guess you could say it was Zeppelin, but it was more leaning into like sludge and Sabbath. So I dug the early Soundgarden stuff. Some of the Mudhoney stuff was kind of punk rock, and I like punk rock. But as the grunge thing became more commercial, by the time that Alice in Chains was a thing, I pulled away from it and I was listening to like death metal and stuff like that. I wanted something that was more extreme. I wasn't into and John, you said it right when you said it was kind of like a relaxed rock kind of a thing, the grunge.
Yeah,
And I wasn't really into that. So I didn't really spend a lot of time on grunge. So my receptors weren't really in tune to grunge when I came across cross purposes. So there could be a lot of similarities to grunge, but I'm not the person that would recognize them. The things that I liked about it were that I thought the guitar riffs were good. These are all the things we talked about in the podcast, but I'll reiterate for this discussion. I thought the guitar was in a better place in the mix. I mean, I could hear. I mean, I'm a big fan of Iommi's guitar tone. I love that rich, heavy tone. I can't think of any other guitar player that has such an amazing guitar tone, such a heavy tone as Tony Iommi, and it's such a big part of what I expect to hear when I listen to Black Sabbath. And that was back, and I was really appreciative of that. I thought the songs, like you said, yeah, they're some of them are a little tentative. Some of them they made some strange choices with, but other ones are just really they just fire perfectly. I really liked Cross the Thorns. I like the opener. But basically all of side one, and I like Dying for Love too, as a ballady power ballad for lack of a better term. I thought it was really well done, and I like Tony's vocal performance. To me, if there's an air of sincerity in there, I'm with it. If it seems contrived or it seems forced, I just don't have any time for it. But overall, from Tony Martin's vocals, I really get a greater sense of sincerity. Like he actually made it a creative commitment to the album. His lyrics are a little bit more covering a wider range of subjects, not in like the gratuitous, so this is what people think we should write lyrics about kind of a thing that I think was on Headless Cross. This seemed to be a little bit coming from more of a sincere area. So I mean, I appreciated all that. I like the production. I like Bobby Rondinelli. I thought he was a great drummer for Sabbath at the time. I think he did more. I mean, technically, I guess you could say Cozy Powell's a better drummer, but what Bobby Rondinelli did on Cross Purposes was more impressive to me than what Cozy Powell did on Headless Cross and Tear. So I'm going to grade it on that. Um, but as far as the grunge thing being in the background, you could say that about the previous Tony Martin albums too, because you have Eternal Idol, which there are couple songs like let's replace the grunge influence that we say is in the background across purposes and replace grunge with hair metal. I hear some hair metal on Eternal Idol, and that's a little distracting. In fact, that's probably more distracting to me than the grunge thing is in the background on cross purposes. Like for instance, Tony Martin well, first of all, he's working off the Ray Gillan template vocally. And Ray Gillan, if anything, he's not a British blues rock singer. Ray Gillan, if anything, is a young guy. He's like a hair metal singer,
Yeah,
hair band singer, to me anyway. And kind of reinforced that when he went into Badlands. And I like Badlands for what they are. I like Jake,
yeah, and they're
and it
the
was cool.
bluesier part of hair metal, at least.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd say
But there
that.
was a couple songs on Eternal Idol. One was Hard Life to Love, and the other was Born to Lose. Those two songs, they could have been done by like Lynch Mob or Hurricane or one of those hair metal bands, and it would have sounded, like it was like one of their songs. But here it was on a Black Sabbath album. The only thing that really kind of made it sound different was you could hear Tony Iommi's guitar playing. That sounds like Tony Iommi, but the way that Tony Martin sings, the song structure, even the riffs are kind of like kind of hair metal. But two songs out of what 10 songs on the album, I don't mind it so much. Well, then we move forward and we're going into to Headless Cross, and to me, it's like when John said that we thought that Tony Martin, well, he thought that Tony Martin was coming into his own. I echo that because I feel like cross purposes is when Tony Martin seems like he's most comfortable with the situation. With Headless Cross, he's coming in, he sounds a little bit like Dio, the title track. He's making his voice, he's affecting his voice, so it has a little bit of a gruffer tone, almost as though he's trying to sound like, what would Dio do if he were singing the song? And I hear that a couple times, but then it goes from there and it goes into like uh, Devil and Daughter, which is pretty cool, but Call of the Wild, and it gets kind of into like this White Snake territory. So that's the drawback for me there. And that to me is more distracting because I want my Sabbath to sound like Sabbath. If I want to listen to White Snake, I'll listen to White Snake. I don't want to hear White Snake when I'm listening to Sabbath. So that's a distraction. I have since warmed up to the album a little bit more. Part of it is because I really like the way that it's remastered. It may seem like a minor thing, but it makes a difference to me. And I've been getting back into it and trying to like move away from some of the things or get over some of the obstacles that always prohibited me from getting into it before. So, but that's my thing with Headless Cross. As far as Tony Martin not really being acclimated to Black Sabbath, then we move on to Tear, and with Tear, it seemed like now Sabbath is beginning to lose its identity. Black Sabbath aesthetics are now where they were present on Headless Cross because we had songs about witches and bats and uh
Devils and
headless
Daughters.
headless cross and things like that were more germane to the Black Sabbath aesthetic. Now we're getting into Tear and we're pulling away from that stuff and we're getting into we got Feels Good to Me, which is a full-on like sappy power ballad, and then we've got this Norse mythology thing that kind of inserts itself halfway through the album, and that's weird. So that was distracting to me. So now it seems like, is Tony Martin the reason that Black Sabbath isn't sounding like Black Sabbath, or what's going on? But the one constant, the one common denominator in these albums that all have issues with them is this singer. And on each album, he sounds kind of different. It sounds like he's coming in the band with a different mindset on each album. But by the time we get to Cross Purposes, it seems like the music to me sounds more confident. I'm hearing the guitar more up front. I'm hearing cool riffs, Black Sabbath riffs. Geezer Butler's back in the band. I mean, you get into it was a Virtual Death, or was it Immaculate Deception? The one that's
Virtual
on
Death
side
starts with
one.
the
I don't have the
bass.
album in
Yeah.
front of me,
It
but
starts with the
that to me
bass. Yeah,
sound
Virtual Death.
yeah, okay. And Evil Eye, there's the last song on the album. That churning riff is kind of similar to me in a way. Um, Zero the Hero, at least insofar as anything since that album, since Born Again, that's about the closest. Evil Eye is about the closest we've gotten to that kind of a dark riff. The production could be a little bit darker. It's a little bit bright, but it's not as bright as Tear, and it's not as 80s sounding. The thing that it also killed Headless Cross for me was that big bright production. It just overshadowed the music too much for me. I couldn't get past it, and there wasn't a lot of content either. With Cross Purposes, I mean, it felt like this was an album that had a lot of songs. It had a lot of variation from song to song. A lot of it did check the Sabbath boxes for me. and that's why I connected with it. But I also qualify this entire era on a completely different level than I do the Dio and the Ozzy. So when I'm talking about, and I did say that I consider Cross Purposes as I'll include that in my top 10 Black Sabbath albums, because I feel like for me, the way that I would structure a top 10 list, I want to have as much as I could. I want to have every aspect, every element, every part of Black Sabbath represented in my top 10. So Cross Purposes would be my representative uh, album from the Tony Martin era. So that would be the one I'd pick. But overall, I mean, I consider the Tony Martin era sort of a different animal. It's one that you kind of like have to like, you have to get yourself into that mindset. Like, okay, this is completely different. This is a different type of thing. Don't expect Dio. Don't expect Ozzy. This is something kind of different. There are some things that are similar to previous eras, but overall, it's almost a completely different animal. So of this era, I think I connected the most with Cross Purposes. That's where I am with it. And that's why I pick it as my favorite of the era. But I mean, for anybody, I mean, there is no right or wrong. I mean, I can't convince you to like something any more than you can convince me to like something, because there's just so many factors. It's like
Of
where you
course.
were at the time,
Yeah.
what
Yes.
you personally just like. I mean, the things that you just like. I mean, for whatever reason, and so things just hit us in certain ways that just resonate, for whatever reason. And but it's always cool to talk about things. It's always cool to hear, someone else's opinion of albums, and have a deep discussion about Black Sabbath, because I mean I love to talk Black Sabbath.
Well,
That's why we do the podcast. Um,
yeah.
but I
Well,
mean I understand where
I,
you're coming from. Every point you made is totally valid. I mean I can't disagree with any of it. I mean I'm not going to be like, no, you're wrong. This is no, you don't understand. I get it.
well,
I mean I'm completely understanding with anybody that comes in hard against the Tony Martin here. And I'm also like, I'm kind of on their side if they're coming in for it. So I'm like, I'm kind of in the middle. I don't take a hard stance against either side of the argument. I'm just sort of like, okay, I see both sides. So that's where I am with it.
well, I agree with you. If 19-year-old, 20-year-old me was listening to the Tony Martin stuff, I would agree with you 100%. Like Headless Cross and that stuff. I wasn't interested at all in it. I probably heard it in passing. It was just like, whatever. I'm not even interested in this. Like I said, it wasn't until it was, I mean, really for me, like I mentioned, I wasn't until I heard the Ray Gillan version. And besides the fact that he had some pipes on that were just amazing, I started to realize like there's some really good riffs on this album. Like it's just not sounding like the Sabbath that I was comfortable with, because the vocal style is so different. But once I got like it was almost like Ray Gillan like cracked my cherry on like being okay with that style of vocals to it. So that gave me the gateway to accept Tony Martin. Because I mean, I knew one thing. I was like, I could listen to what was it, to Eternal Idol, and even if I didn't love the vocals, I loved everything else on the album. Like I loved all the playing, I loved the guitar work. So I was almost like trying to convince myself to like it or something at first, because I was like, well, I'm gonna like everything else, because that was actually the way that I got into the Ozzy Sabbaths. I was a Dio Sabbath fan before I was an Ozzy Sabbath fan, and I remember listening to Live Evil and like thinking like, well, okay, if I listen to the first Black Sabbath album, I put aside the fact of how Ozzy sounds like he has something stuck in his mouth while singing, it's like I could probably get into this and understand it. And then of course I went from thinking like that to getting the whole thing. Like it was almost like once the floodgates opened, then I got it. But it was like certain points in the Sabbath history, because where I came into it, some of these doors were a little tough to break through,
Crack
because
open.
I was
Yeah.
I was a big Dio Sabbath fan before, like I said, I was an Ozzy Sabbath fan. So I would have probably if I wasn't going into a more underground death metal world at that time, and I was still listening to say what Dio is currently doing at that time, there's a good chance that I might be more accepting because yeah, Tony Martin was what seemed like he identified more with the Dio sound on the albums that they did in the 80s. So I probably would have liked it, but I wasn't on that page at all. So I had to do like a huge reversal. Like it's I mean, I liked call it Eternal Idol, what, 15 years after it came out, and that ends up being like, one of my favorite Sabbath albums now after that. And you know, it's weird to when you have all the stuff here all at one time, it's easier to pick and choose, I guess, what you like. It's not like I was excited for cross purposes to come out. I mean, I knew that they had Dio back in the band, and I knew they did that tour with Motorhead and the Morbid Angel, and I was like, oh, this might be actually kind of cool to see. And I didn't even know that Tony Martin was singing for him. I thought Dio was still in the band. That's how little I even paid attention to it. And it wasn't like, it wasn't like massively advertised. They didn't say like, you know, Tony Martin singing. They just kind of like, because they knew they were smart enough probably to know. Less
Hopefully
people
some
go there
people
at
still
least.
think Dio's in the band.
Yeah.
So I
Sells
was
them more
actually
tickets.
pissed. Yeah, I was pissed that I missed it because we were actually going on a tour at the time when it was playing, I think in New York City at the Palladium or something like that. But you know, yeah, I was like, okay, I'll go, Morbid Angels playing Motorhead's doing it. I'll check out Sabbath. I mean, it'd be cool, like it'd be cool to see, Tony Iommi playing. I didn't know if, who else was in the band or whatever, but I was like, oh, I always put Tony Iommi as a high regards as far as a guitar player, even when I was into like more extreme stuff. So I was like, okay, it'd be cool, dude, but I couldn't make it, so I didn't have that experience of witnessing it live. And yeah, and after watching that the video and hearing the cross purposes stuff, I mean, Tony Martin did an amazing job, and that was another thing I kind of wanted to comment on because that's a really good. You're right, that's a really good live album. I mean, for any Sabbath fan that's accepting of Tony Martin, it's such a great choice of Ozzy songs, a great choice of Dio songs, and of course, I don't like. I think they picked two out of the three songs I think are really bad from the Cross Purposes album, but they did do Cross of Thorns, which is a good one. I mean, that's a great song. That's probably the song that really carries the album for me. It's but as far as like a live show, it was great. I mean, the vibe was great. Of course, it was great to have Geezer Butler, jamming away. Just the vibe just felt good. Even watching the video, it just seems like Iommi's having a good time. He's able to play some songs. Like he probably picked the set list. He didn't have to worry about Ozzy telling him he can't sing like half the catalog or something. So he's probably like, cool, you get to play these songs. You don't have to worry about Dio complaining about playing certain songs, now he has somebody where he just go out there, play whatever the hell he wants, and I thought and I love the fact that it has at least what was it? The song of Tear Amon I
And on
can't
Monday.
Adam
yeah,
Lundy.
Monday and Headless Cross on there. I think those are great, live songs and probably better versions than even on the album. It's a little more raw sounding because I do agree those albums they could have kind of a White Snake vibe to it, I mean, I like the old White Snake stuff, so I don't mind so much, I guess. I'm one of those guys. I like the fact that Sabbath mixed up a little bit with the lineup. Like I like hearing different players playing with Tony Iommi because to me it just it's enjoyable to hear where they go with these new people because new people bring in new ideas, new influences, a different jam with the band. And for me, that's awesome to hear. I mean, it's great, of course, to hear the, whatever the original guys. I mean, they're all great and stuff, but I still get a massive enjoyment on listening to other people singing, any of those albums, I can't remember, I brought them up last time that guy that was singing for him early on, the guy turned to a preacher or whatever, the Jeff something.
Jeff Van
Ben
Holt.
Hold.
Yeah, like I like listening to that stuff because to me it's like it just as as a Sabbath fan, it brings me into their world more. It makes me understand where things are coming or vibes are, what's going on at the time. I don't know, it makes me feel more connected to know about all these little things. But I'm also an obsessive too when it comes to music. When there's bands that I really like, I do get a little obsessive about it. It's kind of like how I am as a musician. I get so into it where I want to know the minutia of everything. That's why I'm one of the rare people like listen to like those rehearsal demos of the of Dehumanizer and stuff like that, and hear the different songs and different parts that weren't used and all
Yeah.
this stuff. But anyway, I'm getting off track with getting back to cross purposes. A couple of points that I really wanted to bring up and that I think makes it extra terrible, just because since I'm on my, trying to explain it, an eyewitness. You guys were saying how much you like the eyewitness is like kind of a drilling song or whatever. And it's okay. It's not a bad song in general, but man, when I popped on that album and I heard that relaxed vocal part that comes in the first, like where it comes like it's kind of like lower, like it's like I'm
Yeah.
just like no, like you want to hear that punch when it fucking comes
Yeah.
in. I didn't want to hear that like that intro to it. To me, that really tainted my. Like I knew going into like, oh no, no, no,
I
Tony,
can
don't do
see
this
that.
to me.
I can see that. And, I keep coming back in my mind that, again, you came into the Tony Martin era through that particular, coming into having listened to Eternal Idol and Headless Cross and Tear, I had almost a reverse reaction where I was like, okay, I don't need to hear you, Tony, singing way up in your range. My reaction was like, oh, wow, he's singing different on this one. He's coming at it from a different approach. And having listened to Tear and Headless Cross a lot, I was like, okay, I mean, I love that, but I appreciated the fact that he was doing something different. But again, I can see if you're coming into it, not having heard that other stuff, you might be like, whoa, what kind of Black Sabbath singer is this? What is this guy doing to?
It,
Because it is almost like he's speaking in those verses,
it,
it's
it,
very kind of low key. And yeah, I can see how that would be a
it,
little bit
it
like,
was
hey, what's happening here?
right off the bat. It gave me the vibe that's like it's you could tell it's a like an Alice in Chains kind of vibe going on in his vocals. Like, at least for me, like I don't know Alice in Chains well enough. I only know like the songs that would sometimes pass by on MTV or hear on the radio or something. But I felt like it had that like monotone, like that kind of thing going
Yeah.
on to it. And I I just to me that was just too far, like too far with Sabbath. It's like I could take a lot. I could take a lot of with vocals, but I just to me, I always thought that the grunge scene, um, the way a lot of metal bands cater to the grunge scene just really disgusted me because just be what you are, as a metal band or whatever. Just do what you do, and I don't like. I don't. I mean, these days I don't care. I can listen to grunge and it's fine or whatever. But at the time, I had no interest in grunge or whatever, and it was really bothering me because to me it was like some weird mixture. It was like almost like any scraps could be grunge, where originally I was more a little bit interested in it because maybe it was like an extension of punk or something, which I was a big punk fan. So I was like this, hearing say the early Nirvana stuff or something, I was like, okay, this is kind of like a punky type thing. It's a little bit different, but it's a punky thing and I can get into because I love all that old Black Flag and Dead Kennedys and hardcore agnostic front, whatever. So it was cool, but then it just seemed like it commercialized so quick and it turned into just, you know, like almost instant dad rock or something, but people just thought it was cool because, it was they're trying to say they don't like the excesses of the poser metal scene, which I agree was cheesy, but at the same time, it was like, they're making money hand over fist and trying to pretend like, oh, poor me, it's like, give me a break. I don't go for that crap, it's like, this is all just bullshit. You guys are all making crap loads of money by catering your music to, commercial crowd. They're just doing it a different way than grunge was doing it, but they kind of did what black metal tried to do to death metal back in the day, is say like, oh, this isn't cool, and then change it and make it super commercial. So black metal is like the way more commercial thing now, but at the beginning, they started it by trying to denigrate the stuff behind it. But I am going a little off topic, and I apologize for that. But with the Sabbath thing, it just bothered me when I heard that right off the bat. And I think the song is in general okay. It's okay. It's not a terrible song. It's to me, it pales in comparison to a lot of the songs I like by Tony Martin, I guess. I guess that totally makes sense. But I just really don't like it. As far as the best song on there, in my opinion, is Across the Thorns. I mean, that's just a great song. Tony Martin saying it, Dio could probably sing it good. I'd even love to hear Ian Gillan singing the song. I think it would be awesome. It could totally work. It's it's really what to me carries the album. It's like if that song wasn't on there, I would really have a hard time trying to pick my favorite, because I did make a little list of songs that I didn't think. It's like, in my asshole way, I basically picked the songs that don't suck too bad on the album. I know people get pissed off because I'm so brutal and stuff, but I like to have fun with it. I like to piss people off a little bit. I'm old school too. But anyway, yeah, I picked Cross the Thorns, which I think is great. Um, I it's crazy, but I think Dying for Love is a great song on that album, one of my favorites. And Evil Eye, as I think my favorite songs on the album. All the other ones, to me, there's just major flaws in it that it's hard for me to get by. Like, what was is Psychophobia? That's the one with the offbeat
Yeah.
drum part. That is a lame song. I mean, it sounds it sounds like Tony had a cool riff, and for some reason they made the terrible decision of trying to sing over it when it should have been maybe on its own, because those vocal patterns on there, it seems like he was in the studio just saying, okay, does this fit? Does that fit? Does this fit in the song? It doesn't sound like a well thought out vocal part for me, at least. And just in general, the song that's also the one where it gets the real soft part, right? Where it's yeah,
My
so
colors all turned right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And actually the live version of it sounds better because he's not quite as sensitive on it. But I just don't think it's a good song. I hate to say it because it's very rare that Tony Iommi writes a song I just don't like, but I really don't like it. And then Virtual Death, I know you guys were talking about, and that was the one that totally could be an Alice in Chains song. And you're 100% right. And that's the exact reason why I don't like it, because it's like, why do I want Alice in Chains in my Black Sabbath? It's like Black Sabbath are the gods. They need to be stepping up, going beyond that, not trying to fit in. I mean, I know bands do that. I mean, Kiss did that in the 80s too, tried to fit in what was going on. But I just think that Sabbath doing that, man, I don't want to hear Tony Martin's sing like that. I don't like it. Um Immaculate Deception, I want to say I can't even freaking remember it offhand. It's so lame.
Well, we said the same thing. There are some of these songs that they don't quite stick with you. They're not as catchy as
Yeah.
you might want them to be. Whereas you hear the
But
Dio stuff and the Ozzy stuff, it tends to stick with you. And I hear what you mean about like the grunge thing. But I come at it from a different angle than you guys. I never got into the extreme stuff till later on. I loved the first wave of grunge. And even when I heard Cross Purposes, I wasn't immediately thinking like, oh my gosh, this is, an Alice in Chains ripoff. For me, it just kind of sounded like, to me, Headless Cross and Tear sounded like they were trying to sound more like what was happening at that time than Cross Purposes did. I was just, and Darin, you mentioned this earlier, and John, I'm curious too. Do you like the guitar sound more on Tear and Headless Cross? How do you compare the guitar sound there to Cross Purposes? Because for me, and I believe Darin feels the same way, there's just too much reverb and like echo on Headless Cross and Tear. I want Iommi's guitar to be like Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, man. It's like it's right in
Yeah.
my face. And I felt like
Yeah.
it was way too far in the this too reverbed out on Headless Cross and Tear. And Cross Purposes, it felt like, I think Darin, you said this earlier, it sort of corrected the guitar sound a little bit for me. So where are you with the guitar sound
Well,
compared to
it's tough. It's tough to say because I like Tear and Headless Cross so much, and it to me it transcends the sound of the album. Like, I'm just so used to it. It's kind of like Born Again. I'm used to it the way it
Mhm.
is. I've fell in love with the way it is, and I just, you know, I don't I I like it because I like the whole thing, like it just for me the whole thing works. But I didn't really get into it, like I said, 15 years or maybe 10 years, whatever it was later. So I wasn't being it at the time with what was going on at the time. I was hearing it fresh. Even, I mean, obviously I know what was going on at the time. I mean, I live in New Jersey of all places. I know the Poser scene well, but I was just looking at it as its own thing. But I think, I mean, cross purposes, I don't think any of the guitar tones are. I think the last good guitar tone from the Tony Martin era was probably well, either the live cross purposes I thought was pretty good, but I would it'd be Eternal Idol. I like the guitar tone on Eternal Idol, and even though everybody hates Born Again, like I like that guitar tone on Born Again. I like the guitar tone on almost everything before that. I mean, maybe not the best tone on Never Say Die guitar wise, but most of the stuff I really like his guitar tone. It's definitely more. I mean, it's such a weird thing to compare his guitar tone on, I don't know, Cross Purposes, and then compare that to
Paranoid or something?
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like night and day, but at the same time, you can't really this is 20 years, almost 20 something years later, and technology changes, and
Yeah.
it's like, you know, if he got that guitar tone that he did, it would completely change the dynamic of everything on the album. And for the better or the worse, I don't really know. It's hard to say. I mean, they would almost sound, they might sound like a new school stoner band that's trying to mimic the
Yeah.
70s sound or something. But it might be weird because you can't expect Tony Iommi to, not want to expand his horizons a little bit guitar wise to some extent. So it's all that stuff. I'm kind of skirting around the subject because I don't really have an answer on it. I think at cross purposes the guitar sounds pretty good. It's not bad. I mean, it's probably one of the things that I like more on the album. And I think everybody generally plays well on the album. I think the sound of the album's not bad. It's not it's not a totally crushing Sabbath album, but it's a good sounding album. I think it's just, to me, some of the writing I just don't like,
The
and I don't like the
songs.
vocals on it
Yeah.
more than the actual tones of the album. I mean, it's probably heavier than I. It's tough because I think some of the songs on Tear and Headless Cross are heavier than these songs, but I think the tone on Cross Purposes is a little heavier, but not substantially enough. Like even when I heard the remixes, like I read the remix of Forbidden, I hear it. Guitar's fuller on the remix. It's a fuller mix. Does it really, is it like night and day crushing? No, doesn't. It's like, okay, so the guitar sounds a little bit fuller, but still, still has the lack of interest for me riff wise on some of that stuff. It doesn't make the song that much better. I mean, but I'm also I have less of a I have a more open-minded. I'm more open-minded when it comes to production wise, I'd say, on stuff. I sometimes take the production for what it does, and if the production moves me, it doesn't have to be like this gold standard of production that makes it great. It's like, is the production good for what it is? And for me, I think Tier and Headless Cross, it works for that. It does have kind of a White Snake-ish vibe to it, but for some reason I don't mind it because it seems like it all works. I like the way Cozy Powell works around the stuff. I mean, it I know it's not the most natural sounding album, I would say. It definitely sounds 80s, but I'm a kid of the 80s. I guess I like it.
I don't think a production necessarily has to be expensive. I don't think it has to be something that's like really big and overblown. I think I think the production should have a certain sensibility that corresponds with the band, with the ideology of the band. And in the case of Black Sabbath, it's heavy riffs. It's a certain kind of aesthetic. So I think the production has to correspond with that. And I also think it needs to correspond with the direction of the material on the album. So sometimes bands in this uh I don't know what you call it in this class of Black Sabbath, White Snake, whoever you want to, the bigger bands.
Yeah,
Deep
They
Purple.
go to certain producers,
yeah,
they go to certain producers and they get almost a sound that is similar from one band to the next because it's like, well, this is the kind of sound that the band like us generally has, or this is the kind of when a producer comes in, like for lack of a better example, maybe Martin Birch. I love Martin Birch.
it's
I love
great.
the stuff he's done. But let's say that he's a guy who's done a lot. Blue Oyster Cult, Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Whitesnake. He's done them all. So he comes in and he applies what he does to the sound of the band. So there's like a lot of production involved with the outcome of the record. Luckily, when Martin Birch gets involved with the band, he adapts to what the band is doing. But there are other guys, I think, some of these guys, Dave Jordan, I think is one of the guys, I don't know if that's his name, one of the guys that would like go from band to band. And there was a certain, like, if you want me to produce this album, it's going to have what I do when I
Yeah,
produce. And I think that's a bad thing because I think there it strips away some of the personality, some of the the personality of the band,
yeah, I know.
just what the music is about, and less of a sheen or kind of like a polish that's over it. I mean, I want to hear something that is kind of conceptual from the way the instruments sound, the way the songs are written, and the way that the overall sound that comes out of the speaker hits my ear. Um, and in some cases with the Black Sabbath stuff, I mean, there is like a varied sound from album to album depending on how it was produced or who produced it. I mean, we've talked ad nauseum about Born Again and what we didn't like about it. But one thing you have to say is that at this point, and we were talking about, not to get off track, we were talking about, well, eventually, Tony Iommi said that he found a master tapes and he's going to remix it. And I see a lot of people on Black Sabbath pages and things like that saying, oh, good, now he can fix it. And I mean, I've
Yeah,
said that I had issues with the way that the album sounds, but this far into it, do I want to hear it totally cleaned up? Do I want to hear it the way that everything else did at
Yeah.
1983? No, not really. I'd like to hear a little bit more clarity. I'd like to be specific about certain things. I like to hear more clarity on the drums. I like to hear a little more separation between guitar and bass. But for the most part, that album has a personality and it suits the material, for better for worse. Um, and I think that Headless Cross has a certain personality in the production, although I think some of it was influenced by things that were going on at the time. I think there was a bit of a arena rock thing that was pretty
Yeah.
happening, and that was sort of applied to what Black Sabbath does. I think they're always kind of like, I don't think there's ever been, and maybe it's Tony Iommi, but I don't think there's ever been a total confidence and a total recognition of what their identity was and what their strengths were and what they were so unique and as far as what they contributed to the world of heavy music, heavy metal, heavy rock, whatever you want to call it. It always seemed like, well, should we be doing more of this, what this other band's doing? And I think that kind of crippled what would otherwise have been better albums if there was more of a confidence in the production and then maybe in some of the songwriting choices too. Like when you're talking about cross purpose, it's like I'm sure there was probably um, a nod to some grunge. And I don't necessarily think that was brought in by anybody in the band necessarily, but I think maybe the producer said, well, I know in the case of Forbidden, Ernie C was trying to make things on the production for Forbidden sound flatter because that's what a lot of the production value and the things that kids were buying at the time was sounding like. And then, of course, when they went back and they remixed Forbidden, they went back to a bigger sound. And that's one of the more profound differences between the remix and the original version of it. But Ernie C, who produced Forbidden, said, yeah, man, I wanted to get away from that 80s thing and I wanted to bring it into the 90s. So, when you're talking about some of these choices that were made, maybe it could have influenced the songwriting, certainly influenced the production value of some of these albums. Yeah, it probably was brought in as, hey, you know, Soundgarden just sold 100 trillion albums. This is what they're doing. You guys want to sell 100 trillion albums. This is what you got to do.
Well,
And Tony Iommi, maybe not being fully aware of where his place is in music and and the legacy of what he's been involved with for like 30 years at that time, was like, okay, well, if you say so. I mean, yeah, we want to sell records, but
that's what I
probably
think.
wasn't the right decision. Too influenced by things that were going outside, and that's always something. And one last thing I want to say about just the Tony Martin era in general. When I and I kind of touched on it when I was talking about it before, but there's not. This is going to sound kind of dickish, but there is nothing about the Tony Martin era that just reaches godlike tier. I could say without hesitation that the Dio era definitely does on Mob Rules or Heaven and Hell, or even there's some things on Dehumanizer that are just like, wow. Um, Gillan on Born Again. I'm going to sing the praises of Born Again a little bit here. There are just some amazing things going on with Gillan and the way that he corresponds with Tony Iommi. It's godlike. Ozzy, some of that stuff, godlike. I can't really say, apart from maybe one or two songs where it kind of sort of comes close, that there's really a godlike tier with any of the Tony Martin stuff. I think that Cross the Thorns is epic in that it could be on maybe Mob Rules or maybe even Heaven and Hell. It could kind of integrate with that material, but
Totally.
it's so close, but maybe not quite there. So when you're talking about the Tony Martin era, you have to take that in consideration that this is like something that, man, it's not. It is what it is, and if we're going to listen to it and we're going to say this is a great album, I'm not saying it's a great album across the board, like it's up there with Mob Rules necessarily, but for what it is and for what I how I compare it to the other albums of the era, it's my favorite because certain things about it appeal to me personally. For me personally, I put a lot of emphasis on the guitar tone. For me personally, I put more emphasis on the lyrical subject matter. I don't really care what he's singing about, as long as it sounds like it's sincere, as long as it sounds like it's coming from a creative place. Um, so I mean, some of we talked about it in the podcast, and the things that influenced my overall assessment, my overall final decision on how I rank the album are these things that are specific to what I qualify as important. I mean, that's different for everybody. Um, but I have to approach the Tony Martin era in a way where I'm more forgiving of it. I think that's the best way to say it. I'm more forgiving of it. I kind of understand it on a different, I've come to an understanding of it on a different level than I just, when I was, and some of it has to do when I was a kid. When I was a kid, a band releases an album, you like it. If you like Iron Maiden, they put out their new album, like when Power Slave came out, we didn't criticize it. We didn't like, now I can go back and say, oh, there's some flaws here with the songwriting, or there's some wonky things going on with the production. But when 1984, when Power Slave came out, I was like, this is a new Iron Maiden. I love it because it's Iron Maiden, and I love Iron Maiden. We didn't get that critical about it. And we had younger ears, and our experience with music wasn't quite as far along as it is now. But when I was listening to the Ozzy era and discovering that, and moved into the Dio era, I mean, it all hit me, and I accepted it because they were the masters. They knew what they were doing, and I'm the audience, and it's like
Yes.
I took it for what it is. This is Black Sabbath. It's good because it's Black Sabbath. But now, even like by the time Cross Purposes came out, or even earlier than that, by the time we get into Seven Star, we started coming out of the '80s, and I got a little bit more familiar with a lot of different heavy music and a lot of heavy metal, and in different genres of heavy metal too. I started to get a little bit more critical, a little bit more analytical about things, and then I started to direct that into how I was listening to things, and that's where I was when the Tony Martin era came out. That's probably why I'm a little bit more critical of the Tony Martin era, because at that point in time, I I felt like I had heard enough music where I could recognize something that was good, and things that were bad, or things that seemed forced, and things that seemed more sincere. So
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say, as far as I agree with you 100% about production wise. I think it really started to get more and more loopy, say, Headless Cross, as far as production wise, where they were trying to cater, to what was going on at the time, like you were saying. But I think it's a problem, because a band like that, it's good to have a producer, but if you have the wrong producer pointing you in the right direction, pushing you, and it seems like Tony Iommi, you know, probably was uncomfortable and not 100% sure where his place is, because his place is in the 70s with stuff, and he's trying to fit in, and he can't fit in for some reason like Ozzy fit in, because he's the guy that's writing the songs. It's not Ozzy was able to go into a situation where other people writing the songs, even though they were from the 70s, they still were able to bring something fresh to the table. But Tony Iommi always had to deal with the fact that, like, this is all on his shoulders, and like, I got to try to fit into these things. And I don't agree with that. I think he shouldn't have had to do that. But I think when you have that much, money behind you, and, labels that are spending that kind of money, they want to see sales. Plus he wants to see sales. He doesn't want to, be broke or whatever, I mean,
yeah.
most of the money from the 70s either got ripped off or went up his nose, and stuff. So it's like, it's a mess. But when you were saying that, it triggered me on something in the 70s that really, Sabbath slowly started to get swayed by current events, probably somewhere between Sabotage and Technical Ecstasy, where they kind of got, even though they're great albums, they started to kind of try to fit in. It was like almost maintaining what they had and trying to stay relevant, because the earlier albums, they were their own thing, and they did good because they were totally their own thing. And it slowly starts getting a little more almost accessible or something like that. Or just, even though Tony Iommi was mixing this up himself, in the back of his head, he's probably like worried, oh, bands like Boston and Foreigner are getting popular. Let's try
Yeah.
to keep that kind of melodicness into the music. And even, I mean, the Dio stuff, when Dio was in the band, I think it's kind of obvious that he brought in a lot of influence on the overall way things were in the band too. Even though Tony Iommi probably wrote majority of the music, it was like it was still very influenced by the other people there. He seems like he's the kind of guitar player that's really bouncing ideas off other people and really getting their vibe. Even though he's considered a guitar god, he's also more of a team player, I think, than people give him credit for, because you know, maybe stubborn about keep staying in the band and wanting to do it. But you know, if you listen to Born Again, I mean, there's a definitely a, I mean, obviously Gillan singing on it, but even some of the riff styles on there, or you could say that they were a little bit deep purplish sometimes, you know, Hotline and stuff like that kind of has that little bit of what do you call it, Richie Blackmore vibe too, in a Sabbathy way. And then, you know, it goes on and on where maybe they were trying to either Tony Iommi was trying to go more of a White Snake way, seeing how David Coverdale did so well with being more commercial and stuff like that, thinking he had a good melodic singer that he could reach those places with it. And then you get somebody like you said in the studio, like talking in his ear saying like, this is what you got to do, and we'll be able to get it on radio and whatnot. So it did push the stuff. But for me as a observer from the outside, I find it very interesting to acknowledge that stuff and to see how he's able to adapt in all these situations. And I just feel, like I said, on Cross Purposes, that he that was the first time he dabbled to some place where I'm just uncomfortable with where he dabbled. Before that, I'm not a huge hair metal fan by any means, but I did grow up with the Motley Crues and Twisted Sister, the normal bands that you grow up with in the 80s as a young kid. So it's like it wasn't so far away from me, but the closer it got to grunge, the more it wasn't even like I thought about it. It wasn't like I listened to it like, holy crap, this is grunge, I gotta get off. No, I just didn't like it. It just, once I reanalyzed, I was like, oh, I see why. Because I don't like this other stuff that's happening in the scene at that time. And there was a relation to that was going on that I don't like it. And one thing I wanted to know too on your guys' end, how do you compare this album to Dehumanizer?
Well, I like Dehumanizer better. I mean, because of Dio. I think you mentioned that, you had a point about Iommi and the singers that he worked with. You could say Ozzy and the guitar players that he works
Yes, it's
with,
true.
and Dio is, I think Darin, you were saying, you sort of brought up this point that there's nothing in the Tony Martin era that reaches that Mount Rushmore, godly like status. And I think, and we've talked about this on the podcast, that there's bands that are rock royalty. Deep Purple, we mentioned Deep Purple, Ian Gillan, Richie Blackmore, Roger Glover, Ian Pace. This
Upper
is
echelon.
high class. This is the upper echelon, just rock royalty. And Dio, for me, he's one of those Mount Rushmore guys. Tony Iommi is a Mount Rushmore guy. So when you
Yes.
put these guys together in a room, even if they're not getting along, even if it's not their best effort, even if it's not completely clicking, man, when you put Michael Jordan on a court with this guy, you know what I mean? With those top tier, the dream team basketball players, it's just, these guys are just so good at what they do that it just takes it to another level. So like, yeah, Dehumanizer for me, it has that special element because it's got Dio on it, it's got Geezer on it, it's got Vinny,
But
it's got Tony. So yeah, I put Dehumanizer higher than I would over probably any of the Tony Martin era
but do you,
stuff because of that factor of these guys.
oh, I want to know, like song wise, do you think the songs, not just the chemistry, but the songs are general or stronger on
Yeah,
Yes,
Dehumanizer?
yes,
absolutely.
yeah,
No question
definitely.
about it. Song, song for song, going down from beginning to the end of Dehumanizer, basing it
It's
against anything on Cross Purposes. Yeah, the songs on Dehumanizer
Yeah,
better.
it's
I mean, there's just
interesting.
like
Yeah.
there's songs that just like are just incredible. After all,
Yes.
yeah.
I think it's I think
Yeah.
Dehumanizer is a really underrated album. I see a lot of people on some of these Black Sabbath Facebook pages and stuff, really just piling on top of it, and I just can't understand why. It's like,
I don't get
and
it
if you
either.
like Heaven and Hell, you like Mob Rules, why don't you like this? I mean,
Yeah.
there may be a little bit of like some wonkiness going on with the production, but okay. I mean, the songs are just they're great. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't remember how we
Letters
ended
from Earth.
our podcast on the album, but I think we basically said that we love the album. We started out by saying we love the album. We finished up by saying we love the album. Along the way, song for song, there may have been a couple that I know. One of the things that I thought was that the album was just a little bit too long, like it's maybe one song too long. Not that it was a bad song, but I think that it got to a point where it sort of exhausted itself, and it would have been better with maybe one less song. I don't remember which song that was. And I to get persnickety, I think I had a couple issues with the sequence of the songs. But overall, I mean, it's a fantastic album, and I definitely like it better in Cross Purposes. But here again, I mean, we're talking about the Dio era, and I have to treat that, or I have my outlook on that is different. I mean, I have a different mindset when I'm talking about the Dio era, and I qualify it on a different level. When I'm
But
talking about the Tony Martin era, I'm comparing it with the other albums, and when I compare Cross Purposes from my taste, I find a lot more enjoyable about there's a lot more things that I find enjoyable about Cross Purposes than I do on the other albums that Tony Martin was on. But if I'm going to take it out of that context and just plug it in somewhere in the Dio era, I mean, it's just going to, it's a lot of it's going to get eaten alive because he just doesn't, I mean, Dio as a singer he just had more, I don't know if he had more range, but I mean,
you met a
there was
better
just
Personality.
such an
melodist.
emotional content to the
Yeah.
way Dio sang. It's epic, epic, epic. And it was Dio was Dio. There's times when Tony Martin can have kind of a generic sound to his voice where you could plug him into a generic AOR band and he would fit in perfectly. Um, that's kind of the singer he was. I mean, it seemed like the kind of guy where you can tell him what to do and he'd probably be able to do it. Hey, sing this like Dio. And he could like, something on Headless Cross. Hey man, sing this a little bit more like Lou Graham from Foreigner, and he would nail that. He was pretty versatile. At a
Yeah.
certain point, as it went on, his voice got a little bit ragged out, but
I think
when he
he's
was at the
massively talented.
top top of his game. But I don't think that he was the same class as Ronnie James Dio.
But my point is that since these are albums right next to each other, the two things, what happened? And like, is is it because Dio left? Like, if they wrote these same songs and Dio sang them, I don't think they would be that much better. And I don't think maybe writing wise it's better because I just think the writing quality went down from one album to the other, and it's like only a year apart. And I think for me, Dehumanizer is a masterpiece of an album, and Cross Purpose is like my top three Sabbath albums. So to me, it's I just don't understand how that got
Well, because when you
so
take out
fucked up.
that one element, again, let's use that sports analogy again. When you're assembling a team and you
Yeah,
take that one guy out and you put another guy in who's still a good player, but it disrupts the chemistry of the whole thing. And
Yeah.
there's a certain magic. There's really only, I would even say with the Ian Gillan, I was going to say there was definitely a magic with the original four. There was a magic with Vinny and the Mob Rules era of the band, even when Bill was in the band. And I
yeah.
would say that
Yep.
there was even a certain chemistry and a certain magic on Born Again. I don't think they ever caught that again. I don't think there was ever a moment during the Tony Martin era where, and a lot of people, we've talked about this, the Martin era is kind of confusing because it moves from these different things, but there was never a moment where it just seemed like they're catching lightning in a bottle. Mob Rules feels like lightning in a bottle. Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is just these four guys creating magic, and it never gets there. And that's just for me, it's the personalities. And when you're dealing with guys of the status, the elite status, I mean, there's only so many. When I think of elite hard rock heavy metal singers, Ronnie James Dio, Ian Gillan, Robert Plant, I mean, it's a small club. because
Yeah.
these guys are gods walking amongst men, basically. And when you
Yeah.
put these guys together, and Tony Iommi is in that elite class, and a spark happens, and something special happens. So if Dio was around for cross purposes and Geezer was there and Vinny was there and they were all fully engaged in it, I think that it would have pushed it up a few notches, and it would have made the difference, because sometimes it's the little things. I could hear Dio singing that verse in Eyewitness, but with that Dio snare across the front, it would have
Yeah,
given it, I think, what you're missing from that,
Maybe the
John,
yeah,
pull, I'm sorry to interrupt, maybe the pull between Dio being stubborn and the producer taking control over it. That could be because
yeah,
Tony Martin seems like, I mean, he seems like a great guy and super team player, but maybe too much of a team player
yeah,
where he doesn't say like, hold it,
yeah, yeah,
not just
yeah.
don't do this.
Well,
exactly.
we went so far as to talk about 13, and John, you brought up about maybe the reason that Bill Ward wasn't involved with 13 is because they just wanted to go in, work with Rick Rubin, do what Rubin told them to do, but they knew that if they had Bill might put his foot down and say, no, no, we're not going to do it that way. Let's take this into a different direction. When you're missing one of the critical elements, like I think that the lineup with Dio and Vinny and Tony and Geezer was just as important, just as valid as Bill, Ozzy, and Tony and Geezer. Very different, but I
Yes.
think there was a certain chemistry between those four players that resulted in some amazing music, in much the same way that the original lineup created all that amazing music. And I think that there was chemistry there, and the product of the partnership of those four guys in both those situations, the output was just outstanding. There was never like a band after Dehumanizer when we got into well, I mean, there was like Eternal Idol, and then uh Headless Cross Tier, and then Dehumanizer, and then Cross Purposes, and then Forbidden. So the Dio and Vinny kind of intercepted that run of the Tony Martin era, and that was also kind of confusing too. But prior to Dehumanizer and after Dehumanizer, wasn't a band. And I thought when we talked about Cross Purposes in our podcast, I said, here we go. There's a good opportunity to establish this as a band. I think we've got Geezer back, so that's awesome. And of course, we have Tony Iommi. We got Tony Martin's back again, but it seems like he's coming into his own a little bit more. It seems like he's writing better lyrics. Seems a little bit more confident. So maybe now is the right time for him. Bobby Rodinelli is a great drummer. Maybe he's not Cozy Powell, but he's a good drummer, and he integrates well with Sabbath, and he seems to be pushing himself, and his performance on the album is good. So here's a good band. Let's keep this going. And you would think that when they released the Cross Purposes Live, that they were proud of the band. They were trying to promote the band. This is who we are. This is Black Sabbath, and this is our studio album. This is us live. Get to know us. This is the new Black Sabbath, and that would have been cool. But then it didn't last, and then they went on to a different line. They got Cozy Powell back. They got Neil Murray back, and then they put out Forbidden. But I think that they should have made a commitment with the lineup that was on Cross Purposes, and maybe Cross Purposes didn't land where you thought it should have, but maybe the album after that, maybe if they had had more time to develop a better chemistry, to work off what they had done, and progress from there into something new, it could have been better, or it could have been something that had its own sort of magic for that era. But there was never a time that Tony Martin and Tony Iommi ever had two other members that worked together, put everything together as a unit, and had a personality. And,
But
and
that,
I and I think that, well, John, you said that you thought it was cool. You think it's cool when Tony Iommi gets together with other musicians, and how he reacts to that. And while you were saying it, I'm like, that's a pretty good point. That is interesting. It is interesting to hear how Tony Iommi can be inspired by other musicians, and what he does with it. It's a really good point. But the catch-22 about that is, while that's interesting, as from a musician standpoint, it's probably fulfilling for him. to get ideas, to be inspired by other musicians, and as the audience to also hear Tony Iommi reacting to different aspects from different musicians. But the catch-22 part of it is that we still are now moving further away from the band having an identity and having this kind of nebulous sound that we just can't sometimes wrap our head around. Like, what is it? Is it Black Sabbath? Well, there's a couple things that rooted in familiar Black Sabbath earmarks, but then there's also these other things that are foreign, and I'm not sure I like it. I'm not sure I'm not sure what to think about it at this point. And that's kind of like every album in the Tony Martin era for me. It's like I'm not sure what I think about it. And it takes me years sometimes to wrap my head around it and to form an opinion about what I actually like about it, and do I accept it. And I've always had the hardest time with the Tony Martin era. But Cross Purposes was, of all the albums that he did with Sabbath, that was the one that I had the least amount of difficulty with, and legitimately had songs that I immediately connected with, whereas the other ones took me a little while longer. But
But
you know,
yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a matter of opinions because I think just in general, songwriting's better on the earlier Tony Martin albums, in my opinion. But that's like I said, you could argue opinions all day long. But one thing I thought was also like Bobby Rondinelli, his drum playing, he's a great drummer, but I feel he's unassuming. Like you don't really know that he's there, but you just know the drums sound good. They sound tight. They sound has a good groove to it. He's a good player, but he doesn't have when you hear Vinny Appice play, you know it's him.
Yeah.
You hear Bill Ward play, you know it's him. And
When you hear
even
Cozy Powell play, you
Cozy
know it's
Powell's the same thing. You know it's him. And you know, I like the fact that Bobby's a tight drum player and that he's fitting in good. But I think on this album, he's has too many people that are like unassuming, like just too
yeah.
nice or something, where they're not contributing enough to saying like these are the things I'm standing my ground on. It's like he has a bunch of people there that are just saying, yes, we'll just, this is what you want to do. Okay, let's just do it. You're the boss or something, or maybe the producer is the boss, whoever's the boss in the situation. Maybe like obviously probably at practice, Tony's the boss. And then at the studio, I'm a new boss and everyone's just sitting there following. And that's like the problem about having, would be more like session musicians. You want people that are still going to
Yeah.
have like you want to have them in the band because there's a reason they're bringing something to the table. Like Neil Murray's a great bass player, but there's nothing that he does that I'm just like, that's Neil Murray. It's like I always kind of just joke about it. Like he's just there, he's going away. Yep, he's playing the parts, he's doing great, but it's just different. It's not even the fact that a Geezer Butler is the original guy. There's this when Geezer Butler plays, it's Geezer Butler. He has this rugged vibe to it.
Yeah.
It might even be a little sloppier or something, but it just sounds better that Neil Murray's playing this perfect bass line. It's great and it sounds good, but it's just different. And the same thing, I think, with some of the other members that he had throughout it. It's like that was probably the part that sterilized the songs a little more when Tony Iommi's working with people with stronger opinions on stuff. Because you got to imagine, like, I'm Born Again dealing with Ian Gillan. Ian Gillan's
Yeah.
not going to be like, yeah, whatever, it's all good. Or like,
Yeah.
sing the part like this or something. He's going to be like, fuck you, or something. So,
Well, and that
yeah,
goes back to my point where I said about
yes,
this sort of elite quality of players. Cozy Powell, he's another one of these unique players that walk into situations and they really, really bring something to the table. And I agree with you about Bobby Rondinelli. The drums sound good, they're tight and everything, but how much personality, uniqueness does he really bring into it? And maybe that's sort of
this,
the issue with the Tony
I,
Martin era in
I,
general,
this is where I'm going to disagree with you regarding Bobby Rondinelli. With Cozy Powell, especially on Headless Cross. I mean, it could have been a drum machine because the drums are so gated. There's no ghost notes. There's nothing that sounds like anything that I would compare to Cozy's playing with Michael Schenker Group or with Rainbow. I mean, I just don't hear a lot of that great Cozy Powell
Yes.
on Headless Cross.
And that goes
With
to
Bobby
the
Rondinelli,
production.
I'm hearing some double kick runs. I'm hearing the drums are recorded differently. There's not as much effects. To me, the drums pop out more, and there is a certain. To me, they sound more confident. In spite of the fact that this is Bobby Rondinelli's first album with Sabbath, I think that he went in and he played the way that Bobby Rondinelli plays. I don't necessarily think he played in a way that he felt was appropriate or just to get the job done. To me, I do hear personality, and I mentioned that in the podcast that maybe it's not as much personality as Vinny, but because we've had more experience with Vinny. Vinny had been on 3 albums by the time we get to Dehumanizer, so we know what he sounds like. We can hear his personality in his playing. Bobby Rondinelli, prior to this album, I'm only familiar with him through Rainbow, but I
Yes.
do hear a similarity with the way he plays on Cross Purposes to the way he plays on Rainbow. I think it was Straight Between the Eyes. Good
Yeah, I
drums
think
on
he
that.
plays fits better in that, my opinion. Straight between the eyes. It's almost like that vibe that he has just works really good with the Richie Blackmore vibe on that album.
Okay.
Better than
But
this.
I hear, yeah, yeah. I mean, he sounds great on Straight Between the Eyes, and I think I saw. Oh, there was the Live Between the Eyes live video, and he does some solos, and of course the camera's on him when he's playing, and he's a very active drummer. Um, and again, you could see on Cross Purposes Live that he's still a pretty active drummer when he was with Black Sabbath. Um, Different music demands you play a little differently. But I mean, I think there was enough of Bobby Rondinelli's personality that came through in the playing on Cross Purpose to me, to my ears, to what I noticed. I personally noticed that it didn't seem like he was just like coasting along and just underplaying the album. So I thought he did a good job, and I was pleased with the drums, and I made mention of the fact that there are some cool drum fills and there's some cool drum runs and things that he does that I think adds something to the way that the album sounds and adds some importance to him being in the band. But with Cozy Powell, I was almost disappointed the first time I heard Headless Cross. I'm like, man, this doesn't sound like Cozy Powell. It sounds like a drum machine. The drums are they're so saturated with effects and they're so gated. I mean, but when this remaster came out and some of that seemed to be rolled off a little bit, and I heard the drums sound a little bit different on Headless Cross and Remastered, then I could recognize more of Cozy. I just think it was a detriment the way that that album was produced. And again, the same thing was present on Tier. I think there was like way too many effects, and I mean that was all by Cozy's choice. That's the way he wanted his drums to sound. That he was in control of that. He wanted his drums to sound like that, and I think maybe it had something to do with the way that things were sounding in the 80s, and that's the way he wanted. He wanted it to assimilate, or he wanted it to sound big. But I mean, they don't even sound like drums. I mean, the
Well,
toms don't actually sound like acoustic drums. They sound like, I don't know, like something that has some kind of a triggered effect on it.
that's
And that
like
was like,
what's it, the Def Leppard syndrome, you know?
Rick Allen. Yeah, yeah. I mean, they
Mutt
don't even sound
Lang,
like
the
drums.
Mutt Lang
Yeah, the
drum
Mutt Lang,
sound.
yes.
All
Yeah.
right, well, I think we could say that if there's any way to sum it up, the Tony Martin era of the band is definitely one that brings out feelings in people. We get
One
to-
quick thing that hurt me is that when you said that Immaculate Deception was better off anything off Tier, it brought a tear to my eye when I heard that.
Sorry, we don't mean
Uh,
to, we don't mean to do that to people. But
I think I might have said that because
yeah,
I'm the one who's come out pretty hard about Tier. I mean, that's why when we do the podcast, I'll go off. We'll start out, and I'll have a pretty good memory of the album. It'll be in my mind, but within 24 hours before we do the podcast, I'll listen to it again, and I want my ears fresh. I want to have a different, or I want to have a renewed perspective on the album when we start talking about it. And when I listened to Cross Purposes before we did the podcast, I was really into it. It hit me at the right time, and I was in the right mood for it. John and I, when we did our Tier, I think I was more supportive of Tier than you were, John, when we did the podcast. that kind of surprised me because I've never really been a big fan of Tear. There's a few songs I love. The Sabbath Stones, Heaven in Black is pretty cool. The Lawmaker is cool. I like Anno Mundi, and I do like Jerusalem. I'm not into the Odin's Ride and Tyr, and I'm not into that whole Norse section part of the album at all. That I'm kind of lost on that. Um, but yeah, I think what I liked about Immaculate Deception was that it was more riff driven, and there weren't enough riff driven for me. There weren't enough riff driven songs on Tier, and that's what kind of I thought was lacking on the album. It's a Black Sabbath album. I mean, you got to have guitar. You know, Tony Iommi's guitar has to be front and center. It shouldn't be sharing space with the keyboard. You know, I just couldn't wrap my head around that. So it it, it could have been a little bit of hyperbole with Immaculate Deception, but on the other hand, I mean, I guess I was coming at it from the perspective of like, this is more of what I want to hear when I'm listening to Black Sabbath. I want to hear guitar. I want to hear bass, and I want to hear drums. And I don't want to hear keyboards running neck and neck with any of the other primary instruments, you know. And I had too much of that on Tier, and it kind of like they lost me on that. They
I
lost
like
me with
it
all
on
the
Technical
keyboards.
Ecstasy.
Um, I still hear a lot more guitar. I think that with Jez Woodruff, I think that it was a different kind of keyboards too. It was more like a 70s kind of keyboards.
Yeah.
It wasn't like synthy sound effects, which I don't have a lot of I don't
Don't
have a
get
lot of love
Darin
for
started
that.
on technical ecstasy. He's the
Yeah.
president of the techno ecstasy fan. You're poking the
Well,
bear, John. You're
yeah,
poking the bear.
real quickly, because
Yeah,
I know
I know you like Technical Ecstasy too.
I
You
love
know, so I think
Technical
we're all in
ecstasy.
agreement that Technical Ecstasy is an album we all love. So there's no point in
I
like
love that
having
remix
a
of it
done
too.
that.
I thought it was great.
What do you
What's
think
that?
about Rock and Roll Doctor? No, I'm only kidding. No, we're not.
But I, I have one last thing I just wanted to get you guys' opinion on. Then I could leave this conversation in peace. If you had to compare cross purposes with Forbidden, what do you take?
Cross purposes. I'm not a.
I would
Did you
take
hear our
Cross.
cross or did you hear our Forbidden podcast yet?
Well, I only brought it up because I listen when I compared both albums. I was just curious on it, especially after you did the Forbidden one, and I realized that I like more songs off Forbidden, and I don't like Forbidden, but I like more off Forbidden than I do off Cross Purposes,
Mm,
except for Cross the Thorns is better than anything off Forbidden, like I
no.
said. But I just thought it was strange because I always thought Forbidden was the worst Black Sabbath album, in my opinion. I really hated. I hate some of those riffs suck, but they do have to me they have better overall better songs than Cross
And the
Purposes. A
remix
couple of
helps.
them.
The remix does help the song. Does help the songs, but it still doesn't inch it above cross purposes
Yeah,
for me. But
but I just
whereas
wanted to be the contrarian by saying I think if I had to go apples to apples, I would go Forbidden. But if I had my choice, I have Cross Purposes production on Forbidden, and it would be great. And if they split the albums together, they put Evil Eye, Dying for Love, Cross of Thorns, Get a Grip, I Won't Cry for You, and Guilty as Hell. That would be to me that would be a great
wow.
album.
All right, I'm going to put everybody on the spot here to end this. No explanation. Give us your ranking of the Tony Martin era albums as they stand today with the Forbidden remix. Sitting here right now, how do you rank the Tony Martin albums? John, why don't you go ahead?
First, okay, I'd have to go. The worst one is Cross Purposes, then Forbidden. Uh, um, it's hard to say. I think I would go Headless Cross. Um, and my number two would be Tear, and number one would be Eternal Idol. I think Eternal Idol to me is by far the superior album of any of the stuff that that Tony Martin did.
Okay, Darin.
I'm gonna go Cross Purposes. I'm gonna go Eternal Idol, Headless Cross, Tear, and Forbidden.
All right, from my favorite to least favorite, Eternal Idol. Ooh, I'm gonna say Headless Cross. It just inches out cross purposes for me as I'm sitting here right now with the Tony Martin box set. Uh, so yeah, Eternal Idol, Headless Cross, cross purposes, tier, Forbidden.
Yeah. And
All right.
the last thing that I'm pissed off about is with these the box set thing is I think it's was a terrible idea to put them all together in one box set. They should have had their own individual box set
Yeah.
because I know, I mean, I'm sure you guys probably know too, but there's so many bootlegs of this era um between Eternal Idol and you know, Forbidden. There's so much live stuff they could have put on
Oh
there.
yeah.
Yeah.
It would have been so nice to be able to have live versions of all these songs from the different tours
Yeah.
because probably it would bring more people to even like some of the songs that are on some of the albums that they
Yeah.
don't like the production of the album. I think it was a missed
Yeah.
a missed
Missed opportunity.
yeah,
And they should have, even just for people who, because I've heard a lot of people apparently over in Europe, for whatever reason, this box set is quite a bit more expensive than it is here in the States. And I've heard people saying like, "Oh, I want this. I want to get Forbidden. I've never had Forbidden, but I've got the other ones and I'm happy with the other ones, or I only have this or that and I don't want to shell out the money, or there's not enough bonuses to entice me to shell out the money for the whole thing." So I totally get that. Our friend Stephen Keeler, who does the
yes.
rock fantasy, has a record shop, and I saw him comment like it's harder for me to sell a box set than it is for me to sell individual CDs. So I think it would have been better if there was a box set, but that they were also sold individually for those people that maybe don't have the money, or that are just sticking their foot into they're kind of like, hey,
It
not
would have
really
been
sure
nice to
about the Martin era. I'm going to take this slowly and I'm going to
yes.
start with Headless Cross or whatever.
Do what they did for what was it Born Again, where they had the two discs
Deluxe.
in
Yeah.
it, and they just you have the live,
Yeah.
Tony Martin stuff on the one
Yeah.
disc and from that tour.
Yeah.
I mean, some of those live bootlegs I have from that era sound great. I mean,
Yeah.
he's
I
singing like
agree.
a bird on that stuff. It sounds awesome.
Yeah.
It sounds way
Sure.
that helps the argument for my opinion Tony Martin's era Black Sabbath hearing it live because they
True.
were actually better live. I know they have like a bunch of stuff that like rare stuff like Russia tours and stuff where they have all these bootlegs from and they sound fucking great. But anyway,
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
All
you're
right.
right. In fact, when John, one
Okay.
thing, John Gaffney, when we were talking about, we've had a couple different episodes on Lair the Alchemist talking about Tony Martin box set, and I think the question was, what are we hoping that the box set includes? And I said, well, at the very least,
Purposes
we're sure
live.
it's going to include studio albums. But I said, man, there are so many great live bootlegs from in and around, I mean, from 87. 87 was when I realized what an amazing singer Tony Martin was. That's when I first realized how well he handles the Ozzy and Dio era, as well as whatever it is. Well, in 87, he was supporting Eternal Idol. So he was doing songs like Eternal Idol and Dio era songs and Ozzy era songs. And I said, this guy's awesome. I never knew he was
And
that good. So that was the album that opened my, that was the concert, the bootleg that opened my eyes and what made me realize what a great singer he was. And then when we go from 87, there's some great song performances from 89. There's some, on each album, there's great shows from Headless Cross. There's great shows from Tear. There's great shows from Cross Purposes. And they could have even, a lot of people complain, well, why didn't they put Cross Purposes live in there? And that would have been one way that you could further develop or further expand on the Tony Martin theme of the box and like say, hey, okay, so this is the albums he did with Black Sabbath in the studio. But just so you get a wider appreciation or a wider appreciation of who Tony Martin was, here's him singing Dio and Ozzy songs. This is who this guy was. This is an
Yeah.
important part
That's
of
actually
what
one of
he
his
brought to the table.
strengths. Yeah.
So yeah, it was
yes,
a real missed opportunity. But hopefully, I mean, I think there was a little bit of, I think they were a little bit cautious when they put this thing out too, because I don't think they knew how good it was going to do. And by all accounts, it seems to be doing pretty well. So maybe that might open up the door for more Tony Martin related things to come out in the future. Hopefully, anyway, because there's a lot of great stuff, a
I
lot of
mean
great
those
shows and
yeah,
good video and stuff.
those live bootlegs have way better sets than I've seen, they've played in years. I mean,
Mhm.
because basically they were just able to pick whatever songs they wanted out of nowhere and give people surprise and stuff. And that's probably part of their strategy is when people come out and see us, they're going to see us play this song, which you haven't heard us play because XYZ
Yeah.
didn't want to sing it. And I mean, anybody that's watched Sabbath play live, once they got back together in the 90s, it's like it's vomitous how the set is just like the same fucking set all the time. It's like,
First three
holy
albums,
crap,
yeah.
it's like so many, just from Ozzy's era, there's so many great songs to play. It's not mixed up. But with Tony Martin, you get the best of everything. They could whip out almost any song on some of those. And I just remember seeing those when I was checking out bootlegs and be like, holy crap, they're playing this song and that song. And it was really impressive. And it does show the fact that he was versatile because I thought they sounded really good. But
Yeah.
All right, well, there you go. This was an epic discussion. I think we came into this going to talk about cross purposes, and it
yes,
landed up turning into a Tony Martin in general discussion, which is cool. We sort of led in with cross purposes, but the Tony Martin era. If there's one thing you can say about the Tony Martin era, it's people have opinions on it. Let's put it that way. So we want to know what your opinion is on cross purposes. What is your opinion on the Tony Martin era in general? Let us know in the comments down below. John, thanks for joining us here at the Lair. Tell us what's going on with your band. What do you guys got going on?
we're
Incantation.
just preparing for some summer festival shows. Really excited. It's going to be our first time playing Bakken Fest this year, so really
Awesome.
excited about that. It's been kind of a bucket list thing for us, and finally they gave us a bone, I guess, to play, which is really cool. And we have a bunch of killer shows in the summertime. We're also doing probably a week and a half, a string of dates, I'd say, with Left to Die, which would be a lot of fun to play with the old Death guys and the Exhumed guys, what they're doing with that. And yeah, just a bunch of festivals in Europe, and we pretty much have nothing booked in the States for the next until next year. We're thinking about some stuff or whatever besides that. So yeah, right now we just have Europe, and then November we have one show and a Chile Fest, which should be pretty cool because Chile is insane,
Awesome.
absolutely insane.
Cool.
Well, we always enjoy talking Black Sabbath with you here. It's always an epic discussion. This is the Lord of the Rings here, part one. Here, we're gonna have you come back on and have the next part here. So we always appreciate it. So thanks to John. Thanks to everybody out there, and we'll catch you all at the next Sabbath Sunday. And remember, you can only trust yourself and the 19 Black Sabbath studio albums. That's including the Tony Martin albums out there. All right.
Including forbidden and cross
All
purposes.
right. All right. See you at the next one, everybody.